Some people come into your life like sunshine, and some come in like slow poison, the kind you don't taste until it's already in your blood. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something that took me 3 years and nearly everything I had to learn. The person who almost destroyed my life, my career, my marriage, my peace, he wasn't some stranger. He wasn't someone I met in a dark alley or crossed on the wrong side of a deal. He was my neighbor. He was the man I borrowed sugar from, the man I helped shovel snow with, the man whose daughter played in my backyard with my son. His name was Gerald Price, and for 4 years I thought he was one of the best friends I'd ever had. I was wrong about him in ways I still have nightmares about. And this is the story of how I used every legal weapon available to me to dismantle the man who tried to take everything from me without ever laying a hand on him. Let me take you back to the beginning because I need you to understand the height from which I fell and why I trusted Gerald the way I did. I'm Marcus Thompson. I'm 34 years old now, but when this story started, I was 31, living in a quiet suburb outside of Philadelphia called Ridgewood Hills. It was the kind of neighborhood you see in real estate commercials. Tree-lined streets, good schools, neighbors who waved at each other on morning jogs. My wife Denise and I had worked our entire adult lives to afford that house. I'm talking about 10 years of saving, sacrificing, eating cheap dinners, and driving used cars so we could give our son Jalen a childhood better than ours. I grew up in West Philadelphia in a house where the heat didn't always work and the neighbors weren't the waving kind. Denise came from a similar background in Baltimore. We were both first-generation college graduates, both driven by the same hunger to build something stable. I worked my way up from an entry-level analyst position at a financial consulting firm to a senior project manager. Denise worked as a nurse practitioner at a pediatric clinic. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, and that house on Maple Ridge Drive was our proof that hard work could actually get you somewhere in this country. We moved into that house in April, and Gerald Price was the first neighbor to knock on our door. He was standing there with a bottle of wine and the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd known him your whole life. He was in his mid-40s, white, with thinning gray hair and a round face that always seemed to be blushing slightly. He had this warm handshake, firm but not aggressive, and he spoke in this calm, measured way that made you feel like every word he said was trustworthy. He introduced himself as a retired insurance adjuster, told us he'd lived on the street for almost 15 years, and offered to help us with anything we needed. He said the neighborhood was like a family, and he meant it. At least I thought he did. Over the next few months, Gerald became a fixture in our lives. He would bring over homemade pie that his wife Carol made. He would help me with yard work on weekends, and he was always around when I needed advice about home repairs or property taxes, or dealing with the homeowners association. His daughter Emma was 10 years old, just like Jalen, and the two of them became inseparable. Gerald and I would sit on his back porch drinking beer and watching the kids play, talking about everything from sports to investments to our fears about raising children in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. I trusted him. I trusted him completely, and that trust was the foundation of my downfall. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 years into our friendship, and I almost missed it entirely. Gerald had started asking a lot of questions about my work, my finances, my investments. At first it felt like normal conversation, the kind of thing friends talk about. But looking back, I realized he was gathering information, cataloging my vulnerabilities like an insurance adjuster evaluating a claim. He knew how much I made, he knew where I kept my savings, he knew about my student loan debt and my plans to refinance the mortgage. I told him everything because I thought he was my friend. I didn't realize I was handing him a roadmap to my destruction. The real trouble started when Gerald came to me with what he called an investment opportunity. It was a real estate development project, he said, a group of local investors pooling money to build a small commercial plaza on a vacant lot near the highway. He said he'd been doing it for years, said the returns were incredible, said he'd never lost a dime. He wanted to bring me in, he said, because he believed in me and wanted to see me succeed. The initial investment was $50,000, and I would see 20% returns within 18 months. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, looking at the paperwork he'd given me, and feeling this mixture of excitement and doubt. $50,000 was a huge amount of money for us. It was almost our entire emergency fund plus some of our savings for Jalen's college. Denise was hesitant. She said she didn't feel right about it, said something felt off. But I defended Gerald. I told her she was being paranoid, that Gerald had been nothing but good to us, that this was the kind of opportunity that could change our lives. I still remember the look on her face when I said that. She didn't argue. She just got quiet and walked away, and I took her silence as consent. That was the first crack in our marriage, and I was too blind to see it. I gave Gerald the money. He took a cashier's check, shook my hand, and promised me I was making the best decision of my life. For 6 months, everything seemed fine. Gerald would give me updates on the project, show me photos of construction, and talk about the businesses that were going to lease the space. I felt like a real investor, like I was finally playing the game the way it was supposed to be played. And then one day, I came home from work and found a notice taped to my front door. It was from the city, and it said that my property had been flagged for a code violation. According to the notice, my fence was 2 inches over the property line, encroaching onto Gerald's land. The fine was $500, and I had 30 days to either move the fence or face escalating penalties. I was confused, but I wasn't worried. Gerald and I had talked about that fence when I first moved in. He had told me it was fine, that the previous owners had built it, and there had never been an issue. I walked over to his house that evening to clear things up, expecting him to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. Instead, I found a different man standing in his doorway. His face wasn't warm anymore. His eyes were cold, calculating, and he spoke to me like I was a stranger who owed him something. He said he'd had the property surveyed, said the fence was definitely on his land, and said he expected me to either move it or compensate him for the encroachment. When I brought up the investment, asked about the project, he smiled in a way that made my stomach turn. He said the project had hit some unexpected delays, said my money was tied up, and said I should be patient. That was the moment I realized something was very wrong. The next few weeks were a blur of confusion and fear. I tried to get answers from Gerald about the investment, but he dodged every conversation. When I asked for documentation, he said it was with his accountant. When I asked for contact information for the other investors, he said he couldn't share that due to privacy agreements. When I asked for my money back, he laughed and said that wasn't how investments worked. Meanwhile, the fence issue escalated. I hired a surveyor myself, and they confirmed that the fence was actually on my property by 3 inches, not Gerald's. But when I brought this to the city, they said there was already a competing survey on file, one that Gerald had submitted, and that I would have to go through the dispute resolution process. That process, I learned, could take months and cost thousands of dollars in legal fees. I started to realize that Gerald wasn't just a bad friend. He was targeting me deliberately, using legal mechanisms to drain my resources while holding my investment hostage. But I still didn't understand why. What had I done to him? What did he want from me? The answer came from the most unexpected source. One evening, there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, I found Carol Price standing on my porch. Gerald's wife. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes red and her hands trembling. She asked if she could come in, and against my better judgment, I let her. She sat at my kitchen table and told me something that changed everything. She said Gerald had been doing this for years, targeting new neighbors, especially families of color, and running elaborate schemes to either drive them out of the neighborhood or extract money from them. She said I wasn't the first black family he had done this to, that there had been 3 others before us, and that every one of them had eventually sold their house at a loss and moved away. She said Gerald had ties to certain people in the homeowners association who shared his views about what kind of people belonged in Ridgewood Hills, and that the investment scheme was just one of his tools. The money I'd given him was gone, she said. There was no real estate project. There was no commercial plaza. There was just Gerald and his network of lies, designed to financially cripple families like mine, until we gave up and left. I asked her why she was telling me this. I asked her what she wanted. She started crying, and she said she couldn't live with it anymore. She said she'd been complicit for too long, that she'd looked the other way because she was afraid of him, but that watching what he was doing to me and my family had broken something inside her. She said she had documents, emails, records of his schemes going back years, and she wanted to give them to me. She wanted me to stop him because she was too afraid to do it herself. That night, after Carol left, I sat alone in my living room holding a flash drive that contained the evidence of Gerald Price's decade-long campaign of financial terrorism against his neighbors. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear and confusion. I felt rage, pure, white-hot rage that burned through every inch of my body. This man had stolen my money. He was trying to steal my home. He had lied to my face for years while plotting to destroy everything I had built. And the worst part, the part that made my blood boil more than anything else, was that he had done it because of the color of my skin. He had looked at me and Denise and Jalen and decided that we didn't belong in his neighborhood, that we were problems to be solved, invasions to be repelled. He had smiled at us and broken bread with us and let our children play together, all while planning to ruin us. I understood in that moment that this wasn't just about money or property anymore. This was about justice. This was about making sure Gerald Price faced consequences for what he had done, not just to me, but to every family he had terrorized before me. And I swore to myself, sitting there in the dark, that I would dismantle him piece by piece, using every legal tool at my disposal. I would expose him. I would hold him accountable. And I would make sure he could never do this to anyone again. The first thing I did was consult a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a civil rights attorney named Veronica Okafor, who specialized in housing discrimination cases. I found her through a community organization that helped victims of predatory practices, and from the moment I sat down in her office, I knew I was in the right place. She listened to my story without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every detail. When I showed her the flash drive, her eyes widened. She said this was bigger than she had expected. She said Gerald's scheme wasn't just fraud, it was a systematic violation of fair housing laws. She explained that the Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, and that what Gerald was doing, targeting families of color with schemes designed to force them out of their homes, was a textbook violation. She also explained that because Gerald appeared to have accomplices in the Homeowners Association and potentially in local government, this could become a much larger case. She warned me that it would be difficult and time-consuming, that Gerald would fight back, and that I needed to be prepared for things to get worse before they got better. I told her I was ready. I told her I had nothing left to lose. Veronica's first piece of advice was to document everything. She said my case would only be as strong as the evidence I could present, and that meant keeping records of every interaction with Gerald, every letter from the city, every communication from the Homeowners Association. She also wanted me to reach out to the previous families Gerald had targeted to see if any of them would be willing to testify. That was harder than it sounds. Most of them had moved away, some to different states, and most of them didn't want to talk about what had happened. But I was persistent. I spent weeks tracking down contact information, making phone calls, writing letters. And slowly, one by one, they started to respond. The first was a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who had lived in Ridgewood Hills for 3 years before selling her house in 2018. She was hesitant at first, but when I explained what Gerald was doing to me, she broke down. She said he had done the exact same thing to her family, made friends with them, got them to invest in a fake business venture, and then used legal harassment to pressure them into leaving. She said she and her husband had lost nearly $40,000, and the stress had contributed to their eventual divorce. She said she had always wanted to fight back, but hadn't known how. When I told her about Veronica and the possibility of a civil rights case, she said she would do whatever it took to help. The second family I found was the Johnsons, a black couple who had lived on Gerald Street in 2016. Their story was almost identical to mine. Gerald had befriended them, convinced them to invest in a scheme, and then turned on them when they started asking questions. The husband, David Johnson, told me that Gerald had even filed false police reports against him, claiming he was threatening and aggressive, and that the police had shown up at their door multiple times. David said the harassment had been so relentless that they had eventually sold their house for $30,000 less than they paid for it just to escape. When I told him I was building a case, he said he was in. He said he'd been waiting years for someone to have the courage to take Gerald down. With Patricia and David on board, Veronica said we had the foundation for a strong case. But she also said we needed more than just testimony. We needed to prove a pattern, and we needed to connect Gerald to his accomplices. That's where the flash drive Carol had given me became crucial. The documents on that drive were explosive. There were emails between Gerald and two members of the Homeowners Association board, discussing strategies for managing certain families. There were spreadsheets tracking the financial situations of neighbors, including information that Gerald could only have obtained through surveillance or breaching my privacy. There were records of payments to a local surveying company that had apparently falsified property surveys on Gerald's behalf. And there were notes, handwritten notes, in which Gerald had outlined his philosophy. He believed that certain neighborhoods had a natural order, and that people who disrupted that order needed to be removed for the greater good. Reading those notes made me physically sick. This wasn't just fraud. This was ideology. This was hate, wrapped in the language of property rights and community standards. Veronica filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. She also filed a civil lawsuit against Gerald Price personally, alleging fraud, civil conspiracy, and violations of the Fair Housing Act. She named the two Homeowners Association board members as co-defendants, along with the surveying company. The lawsuit sought damages for every family Gerald had targeted, totaling nearly $500,000. When Gerald was served with the lawsuit, his reaction was immediate and vicious. He hired his own lawyers, and they came after me with everything they had. They filed a countersuit claiming defamation, alleging that I was spreading lies about Gerald to damage his reputation. They sent cease and desist letters to Patricia and David, threatening them with legal action if they continued to cooperate with my case. They even approached my employer, trying to plant seeds of doubt about my character and professional conduct. I started getting strange looks at work, started hearing whispers in the break room. My supervisor pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay at home. I could see the walls closing in, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But Denise kept me steady. My wife, who had been skeptical from the beginning, who had warned me about Gerald, who I had dismissed and ignored, she became my rock during those dark months. She told me she was proud of me for fighting, that she had been wrong to doubt my judgment about taking a stand. She said Gerald had underestimated us, that he thought we would break under pressure like the families before us. She said we were going to prove him wrong. Jalen, our son, didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension. He asked me one night why we didn't see Emma anymore, why Mr. Price didn't come over like he used to. I told him that sometimes people pretend to be your friend when they're really not, and that the most important thing is to always tell the truth and stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. He hugged me and said he understood. I don't know if he really did, but that hug gave me the strength to keep going. The first major break in the case came about 4 months after the lawsuit was filed. The Department of Housing and Urban Development completed their preliminary investigation and found probable cause to believe that fair housing violations had occurred. They referred the case to the Department of Justice for potential federal prosecution. This was huge. It meant that Gerald's actions weren't just a civil matter anymore. The federal government was now investigating him for civil rights crimes. When his lawyers learned about the DOJ investigation, their strategy changed. They stopped being aggressive and started trying to negotiate. Gerald's lead attorney reached out to Veronica and proposed a settlement. Gerald would admit no wrongdoing, but he would pay $50,000 to me and agree to sell his house and move out of the neighborhood. Veronica brought the offer to me, and I spent a long time thinking about it. $50,000 was exactly what I had lost in the fake investment. Taking it would make me whole financially, and Gerald would be gone from my life forever. It was tempting. It was so tempting. But I knew that if I accepted, Gerald would just move to another neighborhood and do the same thing to another family. Patricia and David and the others would never get justice. The pattern would continue, and I would have been complicit in letting it happen. I told Veronica to reject the settlement. I said I wanted to go to trial. The next year was the hardest of my life. Gerald's legal team threw everything they had at us, filing motion after motion, demanding depositions, challenging every piece of evidence. They tried to get the case dismissed on procedural grounds. They tried to have Veronica disqualified for alleged conflicts of interest. They tried to intimidate witnesses, including Carol Price, who was now cooperating fully with the investigation. Carol had left Gerald by then, moved in with her sister in another state, and was providing detailed testimony about his operations. Gerald's lawyers tried to paint her as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, but her story was consistent and corroborated by the documentary evidence. The surveying company folded under pressure and agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for leniency. One of the Homeowners Association board members did the same, providing testimony about how Gerald had recruited him and others into his schemes. The walls were closing in on Gerald Price, and everyone could see it. The federal trial began in March of the following year. I sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the case against Gerald was laid out in meticulous detail. The prosecution presented emails, financial records, and testimony from multiple victims. They showed how Gerald had systematically targeted families based on their race or ethnicity, how he had used fraud and legal harassment to drain their resources, and how he had coordinated with others to ensure his schemes succeeded. Patricia Hernandez took the stand and described what Gerald had done to her family, how she had trusted him and been betrayed, how the financial loss had contributed to her divorce. David Johnson testified about the false police reports, about the fear he and his wife had lived in, about the relief they had felt when they finally escaped, even though it had cost them everything. I testified too. I sat in that witness box and told my story from beginning to end, about how Gerald had welcomed me to the neighborhood, about how he had gained my trust, about how he had stolen my money and tried to steal my home. I talked about the fear and the anger and the moments when I had wanted to give up. I talked about my son and my wife and what it had felt like to have everything I had worked for threatened by someone who hated me for something I couldn't control. When I stepped down from the stand, Denise was crying. Jalen was sitting next to her, 11 years old now, watching everything with wide, serious eyes. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I hoped he understood that his father had done something that mattered. Gerald's defense was predictable. They claimed he was a misunderstood businessman who had made some poor investments. They said the families who testified were exaggerating, that their financial losses were their own fault. They tried to paint me as the aggressor, as someone who had started a vendetta against an innocent man over a simple property dispute. But their arguments fell apart under cross-examination. The emails were too clear. The pattern was too obvious. The witnesses were too credible. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. They found Gerald Price guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to violate civil rights under the Fair Housing Act, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal investigators. The 2 Homeowners Association board members were also convicted as co-conspirators. When the verdict was read, Gerald's face went pale. He looked over at me, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. The kind of fear he had made so many families feel over the years. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked back at him, steady and calm, and let him see that I was still standing. Sentencing came 2 months later. Gerald was ordered to pay restitution totaling $350,000 to his victims, including me, Patricia, David, and the other families who had come forward during the investigation. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was banned from participating in real estate transactions and from serving in any community organization. His reputation, which he had spent decades cultivating, was destroyed. The local newspapers covered the trial extensively, and soon everyone in Ridgewood Hills and beyond knew what kind of man Gerald Price really was. Some of his former friends and neighbors distanced themselves, claiming they had never suspected. Others quietly expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to him. A few, the ones who had shared his views and helped him carry out his schemes, faced their own legal consequences. The Homeowners Association was reformed. New policies were implemented to prevent discrimination and ensure transparency. The neighborhood that Gerald had tried to control became, slowly, a better place. As for me and my family, we stayed. We stayed in that house on Maple Ridge Drive because it was ours, because we had earned it, and because no one had the right to drive us away. The restitution money covered what we had lost, and then some. We paid off the mortgage early and started a college fund for Jalen. Denise and I went to counseling together to work through the strain the whole ordeal had put on our marriage, and we came out stronger. I quit my job at the consulting firm and started my own business, a financial advisory practice focused on helping first-generation homebuyers avoid the kinds of predatory schemes that had almost destroyed us. I partnered with community organizations to provide education and resources. I spoke at conferences and workshops about fair housing rights and the importance of documentation. I turned my pain into purpose. Carol Price reached out to me after the trial. She had moved to Oregon and was rebuilding her life, away from the man who had controlled her for so many years. She thanked me for having the courage to fight, said it had given her the courage to leave. She said Emma was doing well, adjusting to their new life, and that she hoped someday our children could reconnect without the shadow of what had happened between their families. I told her I hoped so too. I meant it. Jalen is 14 now. He's in high school, plays basketball, and is already talking about college. The other day, he came home with an assignment to write about someone who had influenced him, and he asked if he could write about me. He said he remembered that time in the courtroom, even though he was just a kid. He said he remembered how I had stood up there and told the truth, even when it was scary. He said he wanted to be like that when he grew up, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. I didn't know what to say. I just hugged him and told him I was proud of him. I've thought a lot about Gerald Price over the years, about what made him the way he was, about whether there was something I could have done differently. But I've realized that some people choose to do harm, and all you can do is choose how you respond. You can let them break you, or you can use every tool at your disposal to hold them accountable. I chose the second option, and it cost me years of my life and more stress than I can describe. But it was worth it, not just for me, but for Patricia and David and every family who came after us. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's paperwork and depositions and long nights reviewing documents. Sometimes it's patience and persistence and refusing to give up when everything tells you to walk away. But justice is real, and when it finally comes, there's nothing quite like it. Gerald Price spent 4 years in federal prison. When he got out, he was a broken man, financially ruined and socially isolated. I heard he moved to a small town somewhere in the Midwest, far from anywhere anyone knew him. I don't know what he's doing now, and frankly, I don't care. He's not my problem anymore. He's a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when you underestimate people and think you can get away with anything. He thought he could destroy me. He thought I would fold like the others. He was wrong. I'm telling you this story because I want you to know that you're not powerless. If someone is trying to hurt you, if someone is trying to take what's yours, if someone is using the system against you, there are ways to fight back. Document everything. Find allies. Get legal help. Don't let fear or shame or exhaustion stop you from pursuing justice. The people who prey on others count on their victims giving up. They count on silence and isolation and the belief that the system doesn't work for people like us. But the system can work. It's flawed and slow and frustrating, but it can work if you're willing to push. I pushed. I pushed until Gerald Price was behind bars, and his schemes were exposed for all the world to see. I pushed until my family was safe and my home was secure, and my son could look at me with pride instead of fear. I pushed because that's what my father would have done, and his father before him. We come from people who survived worse than Gerald Price, and we don't break easy. The last time I drove past Gerald's old house, there was a new family living there. A young couple with a baby. They were out in the yard planting flowers. They waved at me as I passed, and I waved back. They didn't know the history of that house, didn't know what the previous owner had done. And that was okay. They deserved a fresh start, a chance to build their lives without the weight of the past. That's what we all deserve. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and I live in a house that I almost lost to a man who pretended to be my friend. He tried to destroy me with lies and manipulation and the cold machinery of legal harassment. He failed. I'm still here. My family is still here. And if you're going through something similar, if someone is trying to take what's yours, I want you to know that you can survive it too. You can fight back. You can win. It won't be easy, and there will be days when you want to give up, when the weight of it all feels like too much. But if you keep pushing, if you document everything and find good people to help you and refuse to be silenced, you can come out the other side stronger than you were before. I did. And I'll carry that strength with me for the rest of my life. Some nights, I still dream about Gerald. I dream about that first day when he knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a smile. In the dream, I don't let him in. I close the door and walk away, and everything that happened after never happens. But then I wake up, and I remember that the dream isn't real. What's real is what I did, the choice I made to stand and fight instead of running. And even though it was the hardest thing I've ever done, I wouldn't change it, because that choice defined who I am. It showed my son what it means to have integrity. It showed my wife that she married a man who keeps his promises. It showed my community that we're not easy targets, that we know our rights and will use them. And it showed Gerald Price, wherever he is now, that karma is real and justice exists, and you can't escape the consequences of your actions forever. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: the truth always comes out. It might take time, it might take effort, it might take more than you think you have to give, but the truth always comes out. And when it does, the people who tried to bury it, the people who lied and manipulated and thought they were untouchable, they face consequences, real consequences that reshape their lives and leave them with nothing but regret. Gerald Price had everything once: a nice house, a family, a respected position in the community. He had friends who trusted him and neighbors who admired him, and he threw it all away because he couldn't accept that people who looked different from him had just as much right to live on his street as he did. His hatred consumed him, and in the end, it destroyed him. I didn't destroy him. His own choices did. I just made sure those choices had consequences. There's a saying my grandmother used to tell me when I was young. She said that living well is the best revenge. I used to think it was a cliché, something people said to make themselves feel better about letting things go. But I understand now what she meant. The best revenge isn't hurting the person who hurt you. It's building a life so good, so full, so complete, that their hatred becomes irrelevant. Gerald Price wanted me gone from Ridgewood Hills. He wanted my family erased from the neighborhood he thought belonged to people like him. Instead, I'm still here. My son is thriving. My marriage is strong. My career is fulfilling. I have friends and community and purpose. Every day I live well is a refutation of everything Gerald stood for. Every smile on my son's face is a victory. Every morning I wake up in that house is a reminder that he failed and I succeeded. That's my story. That's what happened when my neighbor tried to destroy me and I used the law against him. It's not a story about violence or dramatic confrontations. It's a story about patience and persistence and the belief that justice is possible even when the odds seem stacked against you. It's a story about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be victims and decide to fight back with every tool available to them. The law isn't perfect. The system isn't fair. But they're what we have. And sometimes, if you push hard enough, they work. I hope my story gives you hope. I hope it shows you that the people who try to hurt you aren't invincible, that their schemes can unravel, that their lies can be exposed. I hope it encourages you to document, to seek help, to connect with others who have gone through similar things. You are not alone. There are lawyers who will fight for you, organizations that will support you, laws that exist specifically to protect you. Use them. Don't let anyone make you believe that you're powerless. You have more power than you know. Gerald Price is a footnote now, a cautionary tale, a name that comes up in fair housing seminars as an example of what can happen when discrimination goes unchecked. But I'm not a footnote. I'm still writing my story, still building, still living. And that's the best ending I could have asked for. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a moment of catharsis, but a life. A good life. The life he tried to take from me and failed. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share what I've been through. And if you're facing your own Gerald Price, if someone is trying to destroy what you've built, remember this: you can fight back. You can win. And one day, you'll look back on the struggle and realize it made you stronger than you ever thought you could be. That's what happened to me. That's my truth. And no one, Not Gerald Price, not anyone, can take that away from me.